End of our time, I'm going to ask, I think everybody might be okay with asking a couple more questions. If not, tell me now. This is a question that may be somewhat ambiguous, but I'll throw it to you and you can decide. The question is, you know, we have a lot of discussion today about rights versus privileges. And when you're a Supreme Court justice, have you faced that question, and how do you decide what is a right versus a privilege? We hear a lot about, we have rights of collective bargaining. Is it a right? Is it a privilege? Assuming that issue comes to the Supreme Court, how do you wrestle with that?
Oh, this is a heavy philosophical question here. It seems to me when you have something spelled out in a constitution, that is kind of inflexible. When it is spelled out in a statute, that is also inflexible until the statute is changed. So privileges are things that exist that perhaps some changes could be made. We can't change the rights that are in the Constitution. At least very much, we can't change those rights. Now, collective bargaining is something of a very long tradition in our society. Certainly it has served something very important and valuable throughout our history. And when it's changed, there ought to be a very good reason to change it. It shouldn't be changed sort of mindlessly for some non-substantive purpose. But if it is changed, I'm not sure that we can turn to the Constitution to preserve it. The place you turn to preserve it is the ballot box.
Thank you. I have a lengthy question here that I'm going to try to sift down to one question. The question dealt with the fact that it seems like the legislature in a greater fashion is passing poorly drafted laws, ambiguous laws, that are making it harder and harder for the court to interpret or deal with. Is that something that you're seeing, or am I hinting to something that is a concern, that the laws that are being passed are not as tightly written as they should be, and as a result are presenting problems to the judiciary, or is that not a problem?
Quite honestly, that's not my impression. When I served in the legislature, now this is the former minority leader speaking, when I served in the legislature, there were occasionally budget bills passed, sometimes very late at night, where members of the other party went into a caucus. They would vote on amendments to include in the budget. And sometimes, literally, those amendments were written on the back of an envelope. They were not properly drafted. They were not fully considered. But that's really the exception. Most of the laws are drafted by the Legislative Reference Bureau, by skilled draftspeople. And I honestly can't think of a case off the top of my head where the law was passed in such a way that it created all kinds of ambiguity and problems for the court. What really creates problems for the court is when you have very broadly worded statutes and you don't quite know how to interpret those statutes in a particular unusual fact situation. Then you kind of have to grasp with the words that are there, and if they're ambiguous, try to determine how the legislature would have wanted the case to be decided. That's not always easy. That's one of the most difficult things we do.
Let me ask you a question on qualifications. Again, I think it's been mentioned that both you and Assistant Attorney General Homburg are competent lawyers. You know, you're both able to do a competent job.
Thank you.
The voters want to make an informed decision. If they want to avoid all the advertising and all the media, where would they go to make an informed decision, to get informed, unbiased, objective information to make the best decision between you and your opponent?
Well, in my particular case, you have a record to examine. You can look at people who've actually read the cases. You can talk to attorneys. You can look at the evaluations that have come out of, say, the Milwaukee Bar Association or the Waukesha County Bar Association. Those are the ones that I know of. You could talk to local attorneys and judges. And the basic question is David Prosser doing a good job as a justice? Are his opinions sensible? Are they scholarly? Do they make sense? Are they moderate? In the case of my opponent, we really can't evaluate her record or how she would act as a judge because she's never been a judge or a public official of any kind. So people are sort of voting in the dark for her as a justice of the Supreme Court. And most people feel a little bit more comfortable voting for a known quantity than an unknown quantity. So, I mean, that's the best I can say.
Okay. This question, I'm going to read the question. For nearly 8 years, the legislature has ignored the Supreme Court's charge to remedy the conflict between the law prohibiting carrying of concealed weapons and Wisconsin Constitution Section Article 25. Did the court err in failing to establish the legal status of concealed carry?
Well, now, sir, I wrote the opinion. I wrote the opinion in State versus Hamden, and that is one of my better opinions, going back to an earlier question. I wrote the opinion interpreting the provision of the Wisconsin Constitution of the right to keep and bear arms for any lawful purpose, including bing, 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 and a whole series of things. There was a challenge to the concealed carry law, which is one of the two toughest in the United States, because there are virtually no exceptions to the law. A challenge to the concealed carry law in relation to the new constitutional provision. And we concluded that you couldn't have a constitutional provision like that and still enforce concealed carry law if it was in your home or if it was in your personal business. Now, if your business happened to be Walmart, that might be a little bit different. But I mean, if you're presiding in a business, you ought to have the right to have a firearm concealed in your business. We were very reluctant to go beyond that, and that's when we asked the legislature to consider some kind of a law for a few other well-considered exceptions. The legislature hasn't done that. It may happen in this session, but I don't know. My own advice, although I shouldn't be giving advice on this, the legislature should proceed cautiously and carefully. I think the rights probably need to be expanded, but it should be done cautiously and carefully in a way that's well thought out.
Thank you. One last question. What do you think is the greatest challenge that is facing the Supreme Court in carrying out its role?
That's almost like answering a single question and giving two answers. The court has to get along better than it does. And how do we do that? That's a real challenge, and we talked about it a little bit before. But then the second challenge is that we're living in very, very difficult economic times, very difficult fiscal times. And that's going to affect the judiciary as well as every other part of the government. Of course, we want an economic renaissance in Wisconsin so that more people have jobs and incidentally, more tax revenue comes into the state so that the government functions.